In this episode, I host a dialogue between Rupert Spira, a teacher of the direct path method of Advaita and an internationally acclaimed ceramic artist, and Henry Shukman, Zen teacher and award-winning poet and writer. Well known as influential spiritual teachers, both men have also had prestigious careers in the arts. In this episode, they discuss the intersection of art and spirituality. Rupert and Henry consider such issues as the true purpose of art, narrative as a healing device, art as interruption of the subject-object distinction, the darshan of Rembrandt, and how Chekhov relates to the Vedantic witness. Rupert and Henry also reflect on their own artistic careers, including the importance of mentors, finding one's unique voice, and the relationship between discipline and spontaneity. So without further ado, Rupert Spira and Henry Shukman. Rupert Spira and Henry Shukman, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
Well, I'm so delighted to be talking with both of you here today. This is really such a treat for me. And this whole thing sparked from the previous interviews that we've conducted individually, myself with Henry and Rupert. A key theme in those interviews has been this intersection of art and, for want of a better word, spirituality. And both of you have been acclaimed artists, careers that have attracted international acclaim in the arts. Rupert yourself as a ceramic artist and Henry as a poet and writer. And have also gone on to become, for want of a better term, spiritual teachers. Rupert, the direct path of non-duality, and Henry, Zen and the Sambo Kyodan lineage. And, I was struck by some similarities between the two of you, but also some more importantly, differences. I don't know if you know this, but you were both born in England, you know that part, but you were born 2 years apart. Rupert in 1960 and Henry in 1962. Did you know that?
No, I didn't. No.
Both of you educated in the English public school system, and both of you with quite a lot of roots in Oxford. Before we came on live here, we had an extensive discussion. The two of you had an extensive discussion about the geography of Oxford, where Rupert's now living and where Henry went to school at the Dragon School. Perhaps I'll say something about, just a hint really, about each of your artistic arcs. Rupert, you've been described as among the finest ceramicists of your generation and were active as a potter for over 30 years. And your work remains in private and public collections throughout the world, including the V&A, the Fitzwilliam Museum, the Sainsbury Centre for Visual Arts, and the National Museum of Modern Art, Tokyo. And Henry, your first poetry collection in Dr. No's Garden won the Jerwood Aldeburgh Poetry Prize in 2003, and it was Book of the Year in the Times and the Guardian. And in 2004, you were selected as the Next Generation Poet. And as a fiction writer, your book Sandstorm and Lost City won various awards, too many to list, but among them, Authors Club First Novel Award. In 2006, you're a finalist in the O. Henry Award. And your books have been Guardian Book of the Year, National Geographic Book of the Month, and so on. And you're a poet in residence at the Wordsworth Trust. So many viewers, I think, and listeners of this podcast will be more familiar with both of you, naturally, for your spiritual teaching activities. But I think remarkable careers in the arts also. And so who better, I think, to have a discussion like this? But, despite these similarities, your arcs do have some striking differences, and I may misrepresent you a bit here, so do feel free to correct me when we come round to that. Rupert, we remarked in our interview that your arc as an artist and as a spiritual teacher followed a similar pattern, almost a traditional model of discipleship to a master or mentor, Michael Cardew in pottery and Francis Lucille in the direct path. And subsequent graduation from those relationships to develop your own voice in those mediums. And Henry, your path was characterized by what you've described as lone wolfing. And you write in your memoir, One Blade of Grass, snarling with distrust. And then eventually coming to work one-on-one with Zen teachers. That process had very transformative consequences for you. I think quite different. And there are many, many other differences. But perhaps to me, the most intriguing one, and the inspiration for this dialogue, is the effect that your spiritual journeys had on your art. I'll come to an end shortly. And Rupert, in your previous interview, you said that as you deepened into your spiritual unfolding or explorations, your art actually was liberated, particularly as you resolved an inner conflict between beauty and truth. And Henry, you've described your Zen path as having knocked out, and this is a quote now from our interview, knocked out a core of angst that had been somehow wrapped up in the energy of the creative process, and that you were pervaded by peace, and in fact stopped writing for many years. So I'd like to invite each of you to begin with to reflect a little on this theme, and however it seems interesting or appropriate, this intersection between art and your spiritual interests, these twin trajectories that both of you have had. Rupert, perhaps you could begin.
Goodness, Steve, it's hard to know exactly where to begin with an introduction like that. Let me begin with perhaps just saying very briefly what I consider the purpose of art, or the ultimate purpose of art to be. And it is simply this: to reveal the nature of reality, which is in fact exactly what all spiritual traditions aim to do in one way or another, to precipitate this recognition of the nature of reality. Unlike the spiritual traditions, which tend to use words, the written word or the spoken word, most teaching takes place through writing and speaking, and of course through silent meditations. Unlike the spiritual teaching traditions, the arts use they use words in the case of writing, but they use our faculty of sense perception to reveal the reality that the spiritual traditions reveal through language. And although it wasn't, I didn't formulate this for until I had been working as an artist for many years, I'm quite sure that the reason I embarked on a life as an artist was because my first introduction, the first time I think we spoke about this, Steve, in our last conversation, the first time I saw an exhibition of Michael Cardew's when I was 15 years old at the Camden Arts Centre, it was like this. It was such a powerful, visceral, energetic experience that it was like a kind of crack in my world. It opened me up to a new possibility. So this exhibition was like a kind of initiation for me. So although I didn't formulate it to myself in these terms at the time, the process, my training and my subsequent life as a potter, what was a means of exploring, yes, outwardly in one way, form, material, processes, substances, but it was part of a deeper inner exploration at the same time. So it was both my work as an artist was a means of exploring reality, but also a means of expressing it. And I feel that this is really why we have art in our culture. Really, art, in a culture where people are often struggle to survive, to earn a living, to bring up a family, just to exist, one would think that art would be the first casualty of such a society, that art would, that it would be considered superfluous. But this is not the case. All primitive societies that were highly developed, or most primitive societies were highly developed artistically. Indeed, there are stories from concentration camps where people made art in the most terrible circumstances. Why didn't these activities disappear in favor of the more urgent activities of simply surviving? It's because I think art is something absolutely fundamental to us as human beings. It is a means by which we both explore and express the nature of reality in a not always a non-verbal, because of course literature and poetry are included in art, but using all of our senses. In my case, in terms of ceramics, and touch and sight, in terms of music, sound, in terms of cooking, tastes. But it's an exploration and a communication of reality that doesn't just use our conceptual powers; it uses our perceptual powers, our faculty of perception. And as I think I mentioned this in our conversation, Steve, I know no better expression of this in the Western tradition than Cézanne, who was explicit about this. And he said that the purpose of my paintings is to take the viewer to nature's eternity, to that which is eternal or that which is real in nature. So why don't I leave it at that for the moment?
Yeah. That's very beautiful, actually, and I hardly want to trespass on it by saying anything. Very beautiful. So right, so true, so clear, and brings us right back to here and now, and the wonder of just being here, really, together like this. Wow. Well, I guess I've got to say something. So I can relate to a lot of what Rupert has just said. I think my own, a deep similarity that I want to jump on first is that, I kind of discovered poetry somewhere in I think before the age of 10 even, with a dear friend of mine, Sam Willits, who's a great poet, who also went to the Dragon School. He also was the child of academics like myself. In fact, our mothers were great friends and used to wheel us in our prams side by side in the parks as infants. But, it's at a certain point in our early life at the Dragon School, Sam and I started discovering something alive in words. And I remember kind of pouring through books in the little school library, searching for lines that brought something to life within us, some sense of of beauty, and more than that, some truth, some kind of natural order of things, that certain, especially images that we could discover in here and there as we sort of ransacked books for them, that brought us to life, or brought something in us to life, that recognized something about reality that we didn't normally see, and we probably couldn't have articulated even that much about it at the time, but we knew what we were looking for. And it set me on a path of exploration of reality, that I recognized somehow that there was a way of experiencing this very moment, any moment, my life, that was not the way I normally experienced it. And this came to a head forcefully for me when I was 13 years old. I was up in my bedroom at home, very near where Rupert is now sitting, actually. We were just talking about that, in the same street, a few houses up. I was looking out of the window, and it was the end of summer, and the school term was soon going to begin again, and the annual fun fair, St. Giles Fair, had just started. And I was already, by this time, I'd written a number of poems, and I'd read a lot of poetry, and I was, it was already seeming to be a path for me. And but that evening, as I was sort of gazing out the window, the sun had gone down, and the stars were coming out, and I could just see the lights of the fair in the distance over the rooftops. And I was suddenly kind of seized by a need to write a poem. Once again, it wasn't the first time, but it was different this time. I found a phrase forming in my mind, and I just wrote it down, and I kept going with phrase after phrase followed. And I had kind of given in some way to allow a kind of expression to come through that was new for me. I hadn't experienced writing a poem that way before. It was an immediate means of experiencing the moment at hand in a much more intimate way. And my body came alive. I was tingling and shaking, and I was alive in a new way. And what that new way consisted of, above all, was a sense of this moment, this experience going on right now, being met with a force and an intimacy that I had not known before. And so it was at one and the same time a way of being alive. In other words, a sort of meeting or inhabiting this moment of reality just as it is, and at the same time being able somehow to express it. I think it matches very much with what you were just saying, Rupert, that it's about exploring reality or coming to know it in different ways, and somehow that is bound up with the expression of it all in one. And I knew, this is how I want to live. This is what it means to me to be alive. This is the most alive I've ever been. And it sort of my fate was cast, or whatever. It was going to be poetry, and for the next few decades, 2-3 decades or whatever, in various twists and turns, and in some somewhat difficult ways, and in some very blessed ways, I forged a life where I was supported by writing, and where it was my highest priority, really, or at least it was the central priority, because it was the means to, in my maybe more crass and not so clear way of just saying, of really being alive. And yeah, maybe I'll pause there. Maybe I should add, I suppose, that in that sense, I guess I would have to say that, from the start, it was in some sense a spiritual pursuit. If by spirituality we mean coming to an experience or a way of experiencing that is much closer to this moment, that's much, it's not quite what I want to say, but, that is where something is, our life is not quite our own. We're not so isolated. We're participating in some force of life that is, that does not, in which we're not an isolated, separated entity, but somehow more intimate with it all. Yeah, I'll definitely hit pause now.
So many things that you've said, Henry, that I could respond to. Let me respond to the last thing you said, because it's a word, you used the word intimacy quite a few times. And I would agree with you. I would express it slightly differently. But I think it's the same experience that you're referring to, that a true work of art is be it a dance, a poem, a bowl, a meal, a piece of music. A true work of art is an object or an experience that an objective experience that has the capacity to collapse the subject-object relationship.
Right.
And that, of course, we've all, well, the three of us, and I'm sure all of your listeners, Steve, we've all read numerous descriptions from various traditions and have engaged in various practices whose purpose is to bring about this collapse of the subject-object relationship. And if the separate subject and object are indeed ultimately illusions, then these practices are, their purpose is really to reveal reality, the oneness of reality. And a work of art, I would suggest, is a work of art whose main purpose is to collapse the apparent distinction between ourself as the subject and the object, or the other. And this, I think, if I'm right, Henry, this is what you referring to, what you referred to a number of times as the intimacy, the real intimacy, because the subject, in order to know an object as an object or an other as an other, we must stand apart from that object or person as a separate subject of experience. And for most people, that this separate subject of experience is so obviously and unquestionably what we are, that our entire experience seems to take place in reference to ourself as this separate subject of experience. But of course, as we all understand, that the separate subject of experience is by definition a position of lack on the inside and potential conflict on the outside. So it's inherently unsatisfactory. And in fact, the entire, all the activities that an apparently separate subject of experience engages in, they do so with the sole purpose of divesting itself of the sense of separation, this collapse of the subject-object relationship, what you refer to, Henry, as intimacy, this absence of otherness, absence of separation. And I feel that this is what a true work of art has the power to do. If it's a work of art that involves words, prose, poetry, then it uses the faculty of concepts. But the purpose is to obviously to take us to a place in ourselves that is prior to the conceptualization of experience. But if we're talking about works of art, painting, music, dance, food, ceramics, these are not using our conceptual faculties; they're using our perceptual faculties. They take our senses on a journey. If you're having a meal, your senses are taken on a journey as you taste the meal. If you listen to a piece of music, you follow the music. If you're looking at a bowl, you're seeing it and touching it. And this engages our sense perceptions on a journey whose purpose is not to take us towards the object, but is to take us back, to trace the experience backwards towards the viewer, the knower, the perceiver, such as that the separate knower collapses, and there is this apparent merging of the subject and the object. Of course, it's not a real merging because the difference between them was only conceptual in the first place, but nevertheless, it felt very real. So yes, whilst in theory we know the subject-object relationship is conceptual, in practice we feel it very strongly, and it takes something powerful to collapse that distinction. And such is the power of a true work of art. Such is the power of a poem that is sourced in this understanding. A dance, a meal, a bowl, whatever object is sourced in this understanding has within it this almost magical power to collapse the subject-object relationship and to affect this intimacy, this absence of separation that you referred to, Henry. So that's just a response to a word that you used. It was kind of the essence of what I think you were speaking of, Henry. This utter intimacy, that this absence of otherness. That is the nature of reality. Art, as such, it's an intervention. A work of art is an intervention in our normal dualistic way of perceiving, that has this power to, as Cézanne said, to give us a taste of nature's eternity. Not the idea. We all have the idea of oneness. That lots of us have that. But this is visceral. It's not the idea of oneness. It's the taste of oneness, the taste of nature's eternity. This pure intimacy without otherness.
Yes. It's beautifully put. I agree entirely. Let's just see. One thing I might just pick up on is just the question of whether, I mean, in a certain sense, the kind of thing that really fired me up as a youth in the literary realm, it wasn't. It was some sense that, you know, I was particularly into, actually, among many other things, I got into the poetry of the Tang dynasty, you know, the Chan poets who had given up life in the city and were sort of wandering the mountains and gorges and writing these beautiful poems that were snapshots from their lives, little vignettes, you know, just often just a few lines long, that were made up of images and that would give you this. I mean, they would interrupt the linearity of life, so to speak. There are sudden, pause and immersion in a person's moment, 1,200 years ago, that immediately brought a stop in the reader's life 1,000 years later. They have the same capacity to just not be going from A to B, to suddenly actually there's this other way of experiencing that is not linear, that is it is and a glimpse of boundlessness. I think that's exactly right. I actually did not know that quote of Cézanne, nature's eternity. That's exactly it. But there's something I don't know. I just it's a little tiny little glitch I'm feeling about saying that using words is necessarily conceptual. I mean, of course that must be right, but there's something about the power of the imagination. You know, the faculty of actually having a kind of sense experience, but it's in the imagination that the poem can bring to life a scene in the reader's mind. So it's not quite the same as sort of thinking about concepts in the sense of ideas. It's making an experience of life come alive in, I suppose, sense memory or something. But it's, the imaginative faculty where we do sort of see things and taste things and hear things, the sound of the wind in the trees and the sun glittering on a lake, a sunset or something. Those kinds of images, they create, I mean, it's a small point really, but just, I feel there's some distinction to be made between, more of a sort of intellectual / conceptual, reckoning of things through ideas versus what can be a very visceral experience that the imagination brings us to. I'm just kind of thinking of Wordsworth actually a bit, because he was amazing on this subject. How he would remember with pen in hand, looking at the lake in the evening or in the hills around, and he could summon the sense of these sights not only being somehow immediately present later, but also not only at the time he saw them, but also now as he's writing, the force they have on him. And he was blessed with, from a young age actually, with glimpses of the oneness and of the boundlessness, and regarded the hills as his teachers because that's what they could show him. And what I think I value above all, maybe in writing or in imaginative writing or creative writing or poetry especially, is its power to make us alive through the imaginative faculty. And it's not a matter of sort of philosophizing. Of course it's not. I mean, we both know that. So there's some equivalence between, the beauty of a fine ceramic, its shape in the eye and the patterning and the touch if we're in the presence of it and able to touch it. There's some equivalence between that and what happens in the imagination.
Yes. Henry, I think maybe I didn't express myself clearly. I completely agree with you, with what you say about concepts, that poetry doesn't involve us. It's not a conceptual way of. I didn't mean to imply that. All I meant to imply was that poetry, by definition, uses concepts. And I smiled when you spoke of Wordsworth, because literally, as you were talking, and I was thinking exactly what I'm expressing now, that what I had meant to say was that poetry uses concepts, but to point towards that which is preconceptual. The first lines of a Wordsworth, well known, which you I'm sure know off by heart, the lines of Wordsworth, a Wordsworth poem from Tintern Abbey, were literally running through my mind as you were speaking. Then you mentioned his name. It was a lovely little synchronicity. But to take, for instance, this poem, and I have felt a presence that disturbs me with the joy of elevated thoughts, a sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused. These words, they're all concepts. Every single word is a concept. All I meant to say is that a poem uses concepts, and this poem, or this part of the poem, is very specifically pointing towards this sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused. So he was pointing immediately away from God. He wasn't engaging people in a conceptual process. No, he was trying to take people to the heart of reality, which he sees in the round ocean and the living air and the blue sky and in the mind of man. So they were concepts are just his tools, like as you say, for an artist, sound, tastes, in my case as a potter, clay, touch. These are our materials. Your materials as a poet or a writer are words, concepts. But the purpose is of course, I agree, to take you immediately to something that is preconceptual. So I would entirely agree with that, and didn't mean, I'm sorry if I implied that that poetry somehow engaged you in a conceptual process. I didn't mean that. So thank you for raising that. And I just can't resist the temptation of commenting on what you said initially about a work of art being an interruption in our linear way of experiencing it, and that is exactly what I feel that normally we're engaged, our minds are engaged in the horizontal dimension of time, and a poem, a 3-line Tang poem, a cup and saucer, the taste of a delicious taste. These have the power to reel the mind in, to bring back the mind from its adventure and time and space. It's an interruption of the horizontal line of time, and it takes us into this plunge into the vertical dimension of being. It's not really the taste that we like. It's not really the poem that we enjoy. It's not really the cup and saucer in our hand that we appreciate. What we what we love, what we long for, is this plunge into the vertical dimension of our being. We come out, in other words, the object is we come out of time and we taste eternity. So the work of art is like a portal, which has the power to take us out of time into eternity. And that's what everybody is longing for. Everything that we ever desire, all we ever really desire, is to be taken out of time in which separation, duality, conflict, etc. exist. We long to be taken to that place in ourself which is inherently at peace and one with everyone and everything. And so I like very much what you say as a work of art, as an interruption, a portal through which we pass out of time into eternity.
Yes. Beautifully put again. Yes, it is a portal suddenly into what cannot be compassed, what has no limit. So
Yes.
we go from the sort of 3D, which is essentially limited, finite, and open, into what it's another sense of dimensionality entirely, or even Zen might say no dimension, or who knows, but we burst the bubble. We're out of the restriction. And here's another thing that I want to just bring in. I'm not sure whether this is so relevant in ceramics, or I don't know how this plays in, but there's also this side of literature. I'm thinking of my great love of my favorite novelist by far is Tolstoy, and I wonder why. And I think it's because we follow these people who are searching for exactly what we're talking about, but we're not only interested in the moments they find it. We're also interested in their struggles to find it, the twists and turns of their journey that we identify with so closely. Somehow, even to be participating in their journeys when they're not yet finding it is so, it has some deep therapeutic value for us to be empathizing that closely with somebody else going through it. It touches our true search. Even just to have our true search sort of recognized and validated and affirmed through a literary character, that's already healing. Even, and that already does something to our own sense of isolation and separateness, that here is a master, Tolstoy, or whoever it may be, because thousands of other writers who can do this, showing us what it is that we most deeply yearn for, even when we haven't yet found it, or even when the character in the story hasn't yet found it. Already that is affirming and healing, and sort of confirms us in our intimations and intuitions of what our deeper quest really is, if you see what I mean. So I'm just wanting to bring in this other sort of side of art for me personally. And I feel it listening to Beethoven or something. There's turmoil and tumult and difficulty, and it resolves at some point. But even when it's still in quest of its resolution, it's so powerful and helpful to experience it. And so I think there's something about the narrative element of that is so healing. Actually, this is a little bit of a side, but when I was a student at university, one of the things I wrote a long essay on actually the origins of narrative, and I was doing some anthropology at university, among other things, and there was this whole sort of school of thought about shamanism and being the origin of oral epics. I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole on this, but the sense that what was the purpose of narrative? You see, the shaman would go on this journey that was a kind of narrative, and it would result in a healing of some kind, and there's a theory that the early the earliest stories, founding stories of at least of the Western tradition and others too, emerged from sort of retellings of shamanic journeys, and that so the sort of deepest purpose of narrative, and still today, is always a therapeutic one, a healing one. And that must mean, because we know that the one great healing is healing the illusory rift of separateness. And so, have I gone too far? No, this is just like, this is another dimension of art for me, is that
Yes.
the therapeutic, I mean, that's not exactly the word, but yeah, the therapeutic side of empathizing with characters, that's already helps us in our isolation. But also that, I think I said enough. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm just so enthusiastic about what you're saying, Henry. I want to join you. I love what you say about Tolstoy. That it's about the character's journey as much as about what the character finds, and I think this is so true of a great writer. But I think what a great writer like Tolstoy does, I think it's the same with a great painter, is that it's because of the quality with which they view the narrative of their character's life, that they view their character with this a kind of disinterested affection.
Yeah.
And in doing so, they place us as the reader in that attitude with reference to the character. So the character can be a criminal. The character can be conventionally an evil character, but somehow because the author is interested equally in all their characters, so that the author places us in the position in which they are writing, and which is always a position of a disinterested affection. Mm-hmm. And of course, they don't explain that to us. Just by virtue of the fact that we are reading their book, we are placing ourselves in that position in relation to the characters. And in other words, the author places us in the right perspective in relationship to everything that takes place around us, but in relation to the narrative of our own lives.
Yeah, right.
and I think it's the same that a great portrait painter. I was in the US recently, and I had a day in New York before my retreat began. So I went to the Frick Museum. Whenever I go to a museum or a gallery, I just choose 2 or 3 things to look at and go straight there and look at them and guard my eyes so that they don't get tired looking at other things. Anyway, one of the things I went to look at was this marvelous self-portrait of Rembrandt's. And I stood in front of it for at least half an hour. And it's like in the Vedantic tradition, it's like darshan. All I was looking at was a portrait of an old man. Could have been any old man. But it was, and it happened to be a self-portrait, but it could have been a portrait. It's true of his other portraits of his subjects have this same quality. It wasn't the quality of what he was looking at that communicated itself. It was the quality with which he was looking that communicated itself. He placed me in the position that he was in when he was looking at myself, and so I felt this disinterested affection. And it's not about the object. The purpose of the object is to bring us to this recognition in ourselves, and it's tremendously powerful in a novelist like Tolstoy or like Rembrandt or the same experience. You listen to Beethoven's late string quartets; they take you to exactly the same experience.
Yes. That's absolutely beautiful. I think I know that very picture in the very room you're talking about in the Frick. Rembrandt's self-portraits are such a perfect example of exactly what you're talking about. And by the way, I think he did a number of them because he couldn't afford models,
Yeah, yes.
But Chekhov says that disinterested affection is perfect. Chekhov says to have the ideal blend of irony and sympathy.
Oh, that's perfect. Exactly.
It's
Exactly, because the irony is the disinterested. That's the distance. That's the witness position in the Vedantic tradition. But it's not a cold, distant, aloof witnessing. It's a loving witnessing. Yes, exactly. There's sympathy there as well. It's disinterested and affectionate. Exactly. I love that. I've never heard that before. That's beautiful. Irony and sympathy. Exactly.
Yes. And I'm just thinking, I mean, in a way, that's how I would understand a sort of proper mindfulness, is that it's because it can get construed in so many ways. But I think the real meaning of it is something very like exactly what you're talking about, disinterested affection. I think that's what the true mindful witness is very compassionate, but also clear.
It's cold and warm at the same time.
Exactly.
Yeah. Distant and close. Yes.
That's right. Because really it's coming from a much bigger vantage.
Yes.
It's looking from a boundless perspective.
Transcendent and immanent. It's
exactly.
both. It's both. Yes. Right. It's not one or the other. Yes.
That's right. And that maybe this is another avenue on why we love art so much, because it exactly switches that on in us. And exactly. And it's go on. Well, I was just thinking, just what a wonderful thing it is actually that can in fact be conveyed.
Isn't it?
Yeah. And isn't it?
Yes.
And maybe this is one of the best things about art, that of all the means of conveying it, it may be the best. That actually no endless amounts of sort of spiritual guidance and instruction that are trying to do that may not do it as effectively as one single beautiful pot.
And this is why, even when we're destitute, we're in a concentration camp, art is the last thing to go, not the first thing to go. Why? Because it's not some superfluous bourgeois luxury. It is about the most real and essential thing in our life. And it is one of the most powerful means of precipitating that experience in us. We're happy to give up everything else beyond death's door, but we still make art.
Yes, because it's about who we really are.
Yes.
So no matter the pursuits we may be in our sort of supposed outward life, quote unquote outward life, always there's a core concern, a core fact, a core reality, which is who and what we really are. And at any time, that will sort of, forgive the word, trump everything else, because it's the most important thing.
Yes, exactly.
It's more important than all our pursuits, and this is something that, oh man, when Tolstoy's got a number of fantastic death scenes, as you may well know. I think they say there's 4 great deaths in Tolstoy, and in all of them, that's what happens, is that the character, is in some degree of struggle and resistance and objection to what's happening, and then suddenly, because they're suddenly sort of in one way or another in these great deaths, they're tripped into a recognition of who they really are, which makes the process of death almost unimportant. It's the finding of what they really are makes death unimportant to them, and that can happen at any time.
Yes.
You don't need to be on death's door. At any point, to be tripped, cajoled, coaxed, whatever, into the recognition of what we really are, makes all other concerns small.
Yes. And in this context, death is, as you said, Henry, earlier, it is the ultimate interruption. and it has the same power. If a work of art is a mini interruption in the horizontal flow of time, death is the ultimate interruption, and hence, as you say, for so many people, that the imminence of death, it has this power to it. Yes, to bring us to our core sense of who we really are.
Yes, yes. And that turns out to be kind of the most important thing.
Yes.
And I suppose it comes with, I mean, I'm just thinking again of the, somehow the sort of, the healing here, you know, because when we discover that, it so reorients us toward all else. And we find that, you know, whether the disinterested affection, you know, is now towards ourselves, but it's also towards all beings and everybody else in our lives.
Yes.
So it has this, I want to say it has a sort of moral function in a very broad sense of the word moral, in that it switches on compassion. And that's something that's it's brought to the fore to some extent, I guess, in the Zen way that I've been most deeply trained in. Actually, it's making me want to ask about, because I'm having listened to you on various venues, Rupert. I've heard you talk about your deep training, and actually, you know, when Steve was talking at the start, I mean, I have had various key poetry mentors, actually, but when it came to my spiritual practice, which I only really got into a serious training process after I'd already had a couple of what I would call awakening experiences, but to enter a real tutelage, an apprenticeship, turned out to be crucially important for me. And I get the sense that it was for you too. I've heard you talk about actually your early years. You were already in some kind of spiritual context, I think I remember hearing you say, and then found your way to Francis Lucille.
Yes.
And Jean Klein, maybe? I'm not sure.
No, I never met Jean Klein, but you're quite right, Henry. I did these, in a way, I did two traditional apprenticeships. One in relation to my work as an artist, and one in relation to my interest in the nature of reality. And the first was with Michael Cardew, who was one of the, along with Bernard Leach, one of the founding fathers of the British studio pottery movement. And I lived with him for the last 2 years of his life, and then with Francis Lucille, and they, as Steve said at the beginning, the trajectory that I traveled on with both of them was uncannily similar, although they were in two completely different fields. The relationship, and in particular the extent of my devotion, the extent to which I was willing to submit myself to another person in order to learn what they had to teach. And I was utterly devoted to both of them, to the extent that I kind of gave up my own view. I completely immersed myself in Michael's case, it was the processes, the workshop, the materials, the preparation of the material. It was I completely immersed myself in his way, in his approach, in his methods, in his attitudes, in his vision, in his forms, and then in Francis in a similar way, but more intellectually. And Francis said to me once, actually, he said, most people I can give advice to, but he said, you have to be really careful giving advice to you, because I know that if I do, you'll just do it unquestioning. and he said, I have to be very careful. Because I was like that. I was so devoted. I had given up my own my own authority in a way, and submitted myself, devoted myself so fully. It was devotion to what was being offered, but that involved a devotion to the person as well. And so I felt that it enabled me to imbibe, not just learn, but to imbibe very deeply what was on offer. But it also came with a shadow in that I had to liberate myself in both cases from both teachers in order to, which didn't involve any kind of rejection of either of them. There was never that. I think it's what they mean in Buddhism. I might be wrong about this, but it's what I've always thought they mean when they say in Buddhism, if you meet the Buddha on the way, kill him.
Yeah.
It's that you have to make the teaching, whether it's in artistic form or in a spiritual context, you have to make what you receive from your mentor, from your friend, from your teacher, you have to make it your own, and then you have to give it your own voice. You have to give yourself up to begin with to the teacher and the teaching, the apprenticeship, the master. You have to give yourself up completely in order to be able to receive, because if you don't give yourself up, you can't receive. You have to totally give yourself up. But then you have to take it in very deeply. But then you have to make it your own and not just repeat. You have to forget the form. You've taken the heart, you've taken the understanding in, but you have to forget the form, and you don't do that overnight. You don't just reject the form that you've inherited. You have to gradually infuse it with your own particular individual qualities. What you're giving form to is, of course, not individual, it's universal, but you are beginning to express it in a way that is uniquely individual.
Yes.
That depends on your own body and your own mind. That's very, perhaps not personal, but it's individual. And to do that, you have to gradually let go of the form that you inherited from your master or your teacher, and that takes a process because you've given yourself over so fully. And it takes a while to reclaim, to find your own voice and to reclaim the understanding, to make it your own, and then to find new ways of speaking it or making it or whatever. And I had to do both. In both cases, I gave myself very fully. I took in the understanding in both cases very, very deeply. And then there was this, with Michael Cardew, it was a bit of a battle. Because he remained on my shoulder when I was in my studio. He was always there on my shoulder, what you are allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do. It took me time, and actually it was only the repeated failures that I experienced in my studio that pushed me through a process whereby I had to make the form my own. So I think it was actually the difficulties, the struggles, the failures that helped me to find a language of my own. With Francis, it wasn't a struggle. It just happened gradually over the years. I just began speaking, using my own, finding my own, because I love language and poetry, and just finding my. It was more effortless in the case. But in both cases, it was this process of finding a form, finding a unique individual form to express something that is not personal, that is universal and impersonal. Yes.
Beautiful. I can so relate to that, actually, in both areas. I mean, I had my deepest apprenticeship in poetry was with a Scottish poet, Douglas Dunn, who he had one particular book called Elegies, which is just a fantastic book about his wife dying. It's a really wonderful poetry sequence, of single but connected or related, closely related poems on the death of his first wife, and very, really astounding. And sort of through him, actually, avenues into his forebears, his poetic forebears, were opened to me through contact with him. Through actually being in relationship with a live flesh and blood person. It was critical because so much of my poetic formation had happened on the page or through poets I could never meet because they were already dead, or who I just never would meet because I didn't know them. And I hadn't recognized until I was lucky enough to meet Douglas the necessity somehow of a real live person in the process of the formation. And I spent around that time, I spent, I don't know, 2 or 3 years only writing in meter and rhyme, and not always rhyme, but always meter, which I'd never done before. Since my teen years, I was always a free verse poet, and then had maybe 2 or 3 years of literally, I don't think I wrote a single poem that wasn't in meter, and most were rhyming, lots, thousands of little sonnets, and not one of them was any good, actually, not one. But it was a fantastic training. There was one, and this was, a lot of it was under Douglas's sort of urging, and doing parodies, close parodies of famous poems, really line by line, word by word, trying to write my own poems that were exactly following the format of those poems. And then, one night in the midst of this sort of training, I was actually woke up to go and have a pee. And while I was standing there, I don't want to get too graphic, but just, using the loo, a poem came, a line, and I literally grabbed the envelope of a gas bill. It was the first thing I saw, and just wrote this poem straight out that was once again in free verse, and I could feel the teenage poet coming forward, but better trained, more in command, more powerful.
It wouldn't have happened if you hadn't written all those poems in exact meters. Somehow that discipline shaped your mind in such a way that when your mind was free and open, when your mind was not focused, it's not a coincidence you were having a pee. You were just free and available. Nothing at that moment, because your mind has been so shaped by your discipline, something then new comes into it.
Exactly. And all that training somehow was in there completely unconsciously.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Yeah, it was a new level of capacity to express, and that was very. So that was the first poem that I wrote that would end up in my first collection in Dr. No's Garden. But in the spiritual side, I can relate to it. But I think I was a more. Sounds like I've been a more troubled guy than you. I had a very, in some ways, rather difficult childhood. It sort of sounds idyllic from what I was saying earlier, but I had a terrible skin condition for most of my early years, and I was, and I had a very difficult domestic situation I grew up in, and I was a very sensitive guy, so these things hit me hard, and it took a lot of unraveling, and in the midst of that, I was very distrustful, as Steve quoted that little bit from my book, One Blade of Grass, earlier about that. But it took me, I had a mind-blowing, I think rather profound awakening experience at the age of 19 that sort of changed everything. And but I had no idea what to do about it. And it took me years to recognize even that there were people and traditions and schools and whatever who knew about what had happened to me. I just had no idea what it was. I was reared in this fairly rationalistic and sort of empiricist Oxford background, and the one outlet, the one escape from that had been poetry, but I knew nothing about spirituality and what awakening might be, and I knew nothing about it. So it took me a long time even to find that there were people who would have understood what that was, and then I went through a long period of trying to find somebody, and because I was yeah, basically very distrustful. It took ages before I really did. But then I was very devoted to him and to a second teacher in the same sort of lineage that he was in, actually. And really threw myself into it very deeply and seriously, and just trusted it deeply, and really, I think, imbibed it. I totally relate to that. Really immersed, soaked, dissolved in it, in some sense. Ultimately, really dissolved, sort of completely, thoroughly, and sort of came out of it. They say in Zen, actually, people have a lot of ideas about Zen, and I certainly did, but fundamentally, it really, I think, isn't in the end trying to do something very different from Vedantic, training, non-dual training. I think it's very much the same territory. But there's a point in Zen, they talk about the Zen death, which really is just a, really thoroughly, self is just gone, more thoroughly than before, and more consistently we can reside, be something more encompassing, But there's also a sense in that phrase Zen death that Zen dies, the training process dies, that because in a sense it must, if we're really opening to what has no name, what has no size, what has no time, what has no place, if we're really thoroughly becoming that, which of course we've always been, but really released from all the things that obscured it thoroughly, then even something like a training process must also vanish, and so then we're free, to
Yes.
to allow that to express itself through the individuality of who we each are. And it's so beautiful that it sort of wants us to do that our own way. It wants us to be who we are, and to use our particular way of expressing it, to be who we are in some sense, and so I can, I'm just really just sort of agreeing with you very much about that.
Yes. And perhaps just to comment on your last point there, Henry, one of the most, I don't know, it's the most difficult thing, but something that's very important and sometimes difficult. For those of us that have been very devoted to a teacher, a lineage, a tradition, a practice, some kind of form, is that when we recognize that our essential being shares none of the limitations of our objective experience, that it is free, independent of any kind of form or structure or limitation, then we at the deepest level, we know that we are independent of any tradition, of any teacher, of any particular formulation of the teaching, of any series of practices. We are free, we are independent, which doesn't mean to say necessarily that we may not continue speaking about these matters in the same tradition in which we grew up. We may continue to do that, but we may not. It doesn't mean to say that we lose respect for the teachers, the friends, the mentors along the way. But we don't, there is also a kind of freedom and independence from them. We don't feel we belong to any particular tradition or lineage or person or teacher, although we may still hold whatever path we took in great respect, and we may acknowledge that and honor that. But inside there's a feeling of freedom from any of these forms, which gives us then the freedom when we're sharing our understanding, such as it is, to use different forms, not to be. And that's, I think, to me, that's the real tradition. the real tradition, the real lineage is not a lineage that goes from one person to another person to another person to another person. Although that is I'm not meaning to disrespect that. That is a valid tradition. It's a valid lineage on one level. But I think the real lineage is the lineage of people who have recognized the freedom and the independence, the autonomy of their own being, yes, and the unlimited, unconditioned nature of their own being, and speak about it in a way that is tailored to their own time and place, their own, who have the ability to reformulate the perennial understanding in a way that is uniquely and specifically tailored to the difficulties and the objections and the questions that are raised in their local community, in their street, with the people that they're meeting with. And that is a kind of tradition of its own. To me, that's the real lineage. It's the kind of hidden tradition. It's the tradition with a capital T. No. And as I say, I don't say that with any disrespect to the more relative traditions. I think you know, I'm very respectful of the traditions that I've been brought up in, my teachers, and I also think it's important to liberate oneself from those traditions and then to be free to tailor one's understanding, such as it is, to the moment, whatever that requires. And after all, isn't that what the originators of the great religious and spiritual traditions were doing? Jesus was not a Christian. The Buddha was not a Buddhist. Right. they all their traditions came after them. I'm not suggesting that they didn't have their own teachers, but they were tailoring their understanding to the particular time and place in which they spoke. In fact, Dr. Rose, the very first teacher I ever had, he said to me once, he said, the teaching, the understanding needs to be reformulated by every generation.
Yes.
And that's, I think, if we don't do that, the teaching then becomes a series of concepts and dogmas and practices. It's like canned food. Yeah, it's food, but it's not really nourishing. It's not like a fresh food. It's canned, and the teaching needs to be fresh. It needs to come out of the depth of our understanding, not out of the past.
Yeah. Beautifully put. Yeah, I totally agree. Actually, I've been developing a new program that I've called Original Love, which is all traditions. No tradition is excluded. You know, but they're not really the point. The point is what they all point to, what they're all means to find. And I very much like you've just been describing this, like that, with a tradition with a capital T. Exactly. It's always about how does reality, meaning the deep truth of who and what we are and what all this is, how does it need to show itself, express itself, meet now? What does it need to be? What does it need to be doing now? And actually, the great Zen poet, master, teacher Dogen, you know, he said it's utterly untrammeled. There's no limit to no limit to how it can express itself, and its sort of job is, so to speak, its functioning is just to do that, to show itself, express itself, be itself. And in a way, and our job, I guess, as teachers, is just to facilitate now how each person can discover their own total participation in that, total own authority, as it were, in being that. And it's I agree entirely. That relationship to a tradition, a school, a lineage by which we may have been trained. I mean, that should want us, really, in the end, it should want us to be free.
Exactly.
Otherwise, it hasn't fulfilled its function.
Exactly. It hasn't liberated you.
Exactly. And no, it's an issue because it's very easy. I mean, actually, Buddha said somewhere that, there's 5 kinds of clinging, and one of them is clinging to the forms of one's spiritual training.
Yeah, if you're still attached to your teacher hasn't done a very good job.
Exactly.
Haven't done.
So someone said something like, our job is not to create followers, is to create leaders.
Absolutely. Yes. Steve, Henry and I are getting completely carried away. We'll carry on talking all night at this rate. We're completely ignoring you.
I was about to bring that up too.
We haven't left you a window for you to join us. So apologies, but please join us. Share your understanding if you'd like to, unless you're happy just for Henry and I to keep going. But do please join us if you'd like to.
Well, yes, I am delighted by what I'm witnessing, actually. So don't mind me. That being said, now that you have given an inch, let me take a mile. Well, actually, really, you've both of you gone this tremendous arc, actually, from the beginning to the end. You've gone from the beginning of your training, although you sort of went back to the beginning, actually. You talked about art and spirituality in general. Then you went back to the beginning, talking about mentorship and all sorts of things like this. And now you're even emerging beyond that into its implications for your current activities. So I think it's a complete arc, what we've done here. Yes, what a wonderful conversation. I'm just so staggered by this. It's just so fantastic. And I must, I think, petition you both for a sequel. We have covered such rich ground here, but I'm now even more curious than when we began. One thing we haven't talked about that I would like to discuss with you both later, if we do a sequel, is the process, the artistic process. Henry, you just described almost an ecstatic inspiration as a means of your artistic process, poems just coming to you in a sort of rush like that. Rupert, in our conversation, you've talked about the daily discipline of the studio, of the workshop, seeing your pots come out of the kilns and seeing only the imperfections and being driven by that back into the studio. So now I don't suspect that those 2 dimensions are the only dimensions of both of your artistic processes. Nonetheless, it's an interesting juxtaposition that I would like to explore with you. And also, what makes effective art from the process point of view? There's a concept in Japanese art, I believe it's hana, this idea of union of emptiness with the artistic process. And the idea somehow that the disposition of the artist can have some effect on the artwork itself, that using the art almost as a discipline itself. Does the artist need to be in a transcendental state to elicit that? Is it possible to be pointed to that prior conceptual place, or a time or a non-time or non-place, when the artist is ignorant of it? What is required on the artist's point of view, from a process point of view? I think that's something that would be very rich to explore. Also, both of you now, we've talked much of your time as devotees or apprentices, could we say. I'm also curious, now you both are in the position of the master, archetypally speaking. I know you don't like to necessarily conceive of it that way, but archetypally speaking, Rupert, you yourself in your ceramic studio had apprentices, as you were apprenticed to Michael Cardew. Both of you, of course, teaching in your own ways, have students, whether you call them students or friends on the path or whatever, however you want to say that. Archetypally speaking, that's your role now, part of your role. Perhaps I'm wrong about that. It seems that way. So I'd be really interested to explore from the master's point of view how one goes about accomplishing the process that you've described from the apprentice point of view. These are 2 themes, anyway, that I think I would love to explore with you both, perhaps in a sequel.
Well, but both very interesting topics, Stephen, and we could we could explore just one of those questions in an hour. But yes, it's been really a pleasure to have this conversation, and I'd be very happy to resume and discuss these issues. Yes, certainly.
Yeah, definitely. Me too. Yeah, very happy. This has been totally fascinating, and more than that, very sort of
yes,
feel
exactly.
it. My heart's very warm and full and excited.
Yeah.
I'm very happy to connect with you again, Stephen, and of course you, Rupert, for the first time like this. It's very it feels very I'm very moved actually. It seems like a wonderful thing to be able to sense this sort of collegiality, or
Absolutely, yes.
comrade or whatever, comradeship of some kind. It's very wonderful. There aren't so many people there's a few people that, well, of course I have very close poetry colleagues I've had, and definitely close sort of folks in the spirituality, but the people who really are open in both those avenues and see a way of holding them as one sort of thing, it's very rare for me.
Yes. It's a very special thing. I agree, Henry. You meet someone for the first time and you feel they're an old friend. It's a very particular quality of connection, and where you don't have to know a lot about each other. We talked before, as Steve said, we talked for 10 minutes before this conversation about our shared life in Oxford, but we know almost nothing about each other. And yet likewise with you, Steve, we don't need, it's not necessary to know a lot about each other if there's this deep connection in the heart. And yes, I've too been very, very touched by this conversation. Thank you.
Rupert Spira and Henry Shukman, thank you very much.
Thank you both very much.
Thank you both as well.